Caspian Sinclair had built his empire on the bones of dead oceans, turning liquid gold into cold cash with the heart of a machine. For 10 years, nothing had penetrated the ice around his soul, until a woman chained herself to his most profitable oil rig and smiled at him like she could see straight through to the man he used to be. "40,000 feet above the North Atlantic, Caspian Sinclair existed in a world of manufactured silence and controlled climate, where even the air he breathed was filtered and purified to his exact specifications. His Gulfstream G650 cut through the sky with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him a billionaire by 35, direct, uncompromising, and utterly indifferent to anything that might stand in its way. The call from Marcus Reed shattered his concentration like a stone through glass. His head of security appeared on the cabin's high-definition screen, his weathered face tight with the kind of barely controlled irritation that usually preceded expensive solutions to inconvenient problems. A single environmental activist had chained herself to Platform 7, his most profitable operation. Standard procedure was simple: remove the obstacle, contain the media, resume operations. Caspian had dealt with protesters before. Unemployed idealists with too much passion and too little understanding of how the world actually worked. They were speed bumps on the highway of progress. Nothing more. The live feed from the platform should have been routine footage. Another granola-eating activist performing for cameras that would lose interest within hours. Instead, Caspian found himself staring at a woman who sat cross-legged on steel decking, speaking with quiet intensity to a gathering circle of oil workers. Her dark hair whipped in the North Sea wind, but her composure remained absolute, unshakable, as if she were discussing the weather, rather than chaining herself to one of the most dangerous industrial operations on Earth. What struck him wasn't her beauty, though she possessed an undeniable magnetism that seemed to bend light around her like a gravitational field. It wasn't even her apparent fearlessness, though the sight of someone so small and determined facing down his industrial empire stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. It was her eyes. Even through the grainy video feed, they blazed with an intensity that seemed to reach across miles of ocean and digital transmission to grab him by the throat. She wasn't performing. She wasn't screaming slogans or waving signs or doing any of the theatrical nonsense he expected from environmental activists. Instead, she was teaching, her gestures graceful and precise as she explained something to the workers that held them transfixed. These were men who had seen every type of protester, heard every environmental argument, dismissed every plea for oceanic consciousness. Yet they stood around her like disciples around a prophet, their hard faces softened by something approaching reverence. The rational part of Caspian's mind cataloged the standard responses: minimum force, maximum efficiency, zero tolerance for disruption. He had built his empire on such principles, transforming himself from an idealistic marine biology student into the kind of man who could order the destruction of coral reefs without losing a moment's sleep. Emotion was a luxury he had abandoned years ago, recognizing it as a weakness that competitors would exploit without hesitation. But something about the woman on his screen made those familiar commands stick in his throat like broken glass. Perhaps it was the way she gestured toward the ocean with such obvious love, as if she were introducing the workers to a dear friend they had never properly met. Perhaps it was the memory her passion triggered. A younger version of himself standing on a research vessel, feeling genuine wonder at the complexity and beauty of marine ecosystems before the world taught him that. Wonder was a commodity to be, monetized rather than experienced. Or perhaps it was simply that in 10 years of running Sinclair Industries, he had never encountered anyone who looked at his empire and saw not a source of wealth or power, but a tragedy in need of redemption. His fingers drummed against the cabin's mahogany armrest with mechanical precision, a nervous habit that had survived his transformation from scientist to corporate predator. The woman on the screen continued speaking, her words inaudible over wind and machinery, but her message clear in every gesture, every expression, every moment of contact with his workers. She was telling them about the ocean, not as a resource to be exploited or a dumping ground for industrial waste, but as a living system worthy of protection and respect. And somehow, impossibly, infuriatingly, they were listening. Caspian made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew him well. Instead of ordering her immediate removal, he instructed his pilot to alter course for Platform 7. For the first time in 10 years of corporate leadership, he was going to face a problem personally, rather than delegating it to subordinates trained in the efficient application of force. The woman chained to his oil rig had eyes that burned with the intensity of stars, and Caspian Sinclair was about to discover that some fires were too bright to extinguish. Platform 7 rose from the North Sea like a mechanical leviathan, all steel and concrete, and relentless industrial purpose. As Caspian's helicopter touched down on the landing pad, the familiar sounds of his empire washed over him, generators humming with electrical hunger, pumps drawing wealth from the ocean floor, the constant mechanical heartbeat of an operation that generated millions of dollars every day. He had never set foot on Platform 7 before, though it was his most profitable installation. The irony wasn't lost on him that his first visit was prompted by a woman who considered his entire operation an abomination worthy of destruction. The crew scattered at his arrival like startled birds, returning to stations they had abandoned to listen to the environmental activists still chained to the platform's primary support leg. Word traveled fast on an oil rig. The king had come to his castle, and nobody wanted to be caught consorting with the enemy. Marcus Reed materialized with military precision, tablet in hand and expression grim as winter weather. The security chief had handled everything from hostile takeovers to boardroom coups without breaking stride, but something about this situation had clearly disturbed his usual equilibrium. The activist had been there for 6 hours, refusing food, water, and legal representation. She just kept talking to anyone who would listen, sharing technical knowledge about their drilling operations that wasn't supposed to be public record. She knew things, classified things, environmental impact studies that weren't supposed to exist, operational procedures that should have been beyond her reach, the kind of detailed information that suggested either industrial espionage or a level of research that bordered on obsession. Marcus led him through the maze of machinery and walkways that formed the platform's superstructure, past equipment worth hundreds of millions of dollars, around corners that revealed new vistas of industrial complexity. This was Caspian's kingdom in microcosm, everything precise, efficient, profitable, and utterly devoid of anything resembling natural beauty or organic warmth. Then they rounded a final corner, and there she was. Up close, Luna Reeves was smaller than he had expected, but her presence filled the space around her like an expanding force field. She had shed her bright yellow raincoat, leaving her in a simple gray sweater that was soaked through from sea spray. Dark hair clung to her face in wet tendrils, but her eyes, those impossible burning eyes, remained fixed on the ocean beyond the platform's edge. She wasn't performing anymore. The workers had dispersed, but she continued speaking as if the ocean itself was listening, her voice barely audible above the platform's mechanical din, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. She was reciting statistics about oil spills, their environmental impact, the slow recovery of damaged ecosystems, not with the theatrical passion of a typical activist, but with the clinical precision of a scientist who had studied every aspect of oceanic destruction and found it unbearable. Her voice triggered memories he had buried so deeply that their resurrection felt like physical pain. A younger Caspian standing on research vessels, watching dolphins play in wake patterns, feeling the pure joy of discovery before the world convinced him that joy was a luxury he couldn't afford. The excitement of understanding complex ecosystems, of being part of something larger than quarterly profits, of believing that knowledge could be used to protect rather than exploit. He stepped closer, his expensive Italian shoes silent against steel decking. Something about her voice, the way she spoke about environmental disasters with scientific precision but passionate commitment, made him want to hear every word, to understand how someone could maintain such unwavering dedication to a cause that generated no profit, offered no security, promised nothing but struggle against overwhelming odds. She was discussing the Deepwater Horizon spill, recounting its impact with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from years of study and genuine grief for what had been lost. When she mentioned that he probably had contingency plans for similar disasters, her words carried no accusation, only weary acceptance of corporate priorities she found incomprehensible, but inevitable. The admission escaped before he could stop it. He did indeed have such plans. Her response was to turn and look directly at him for the first time, and the impact of that gaze was immediate and devastating. Her eyes seemed to pierce through layers of carefully constructed armor, reaching parts of him that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten they existed. She studied his face with the same intensity she had given the ocean, taking in the sharp angles that had intimidated boardrooms and broken competitors. When she spoke, her voice carried a mixture of recognition and something that might have been disappointment. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Caspian's recent experience. She didn't beg or threaten or offer him anything. Instead, she simply stated her position with quiet conviction. She was trespassing on his property, but the ocean had prior claims that transcended human legal systems. She accused him of strip mining the ocean floor, destroying ancient ecosystems, contributing to climate change that was already killing coral reefs across the globe. The accusations should have rolled off him like water off steel. He had heard variations 1,000 times from environmental groups, regulatory agencies, and his own conscience in moments of weakness he no longer allowed himself. But coming from her, delivered with such quiet certainty, such absolute conviction, they hit like physical blows that left him struggling for breath. His response was predictable. Defensive, he was providing energy for hospitals and homes, fueling the global economy, maintaining operations that employed 50,000 people. But even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow in his own ears. Corporate talking points that suddenly seemed inadequate against her quiet passion. Her reply shattered the last of his composure. She would have him remember who he used to be. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Caspian felt his carefully maintained emotional control crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. How did she know about his past? His marine biology degree from Woods Hole, his doctoral research on deep-sea ecosystem recovery, his published papers on the environmental impact of offshore drilling were buried, sealed, forgotten by everyone including himself. Yet here she sat, chained to his platform, speaking truths he had spent a decade trying to escape. She knew he had once wanted to change the world, to make it better instead of strip mining it for profit. The knowledge felt like a violation and a gift combined, as if she had reached into his chest and found his abandoned heart still beating beneath layers of scar tissue and corporate conditioning. When he claimed that people change, she shook her head with gentle certainty. People didn't change, she said. They got lost, but they could find their way back. For a moment, just a moment, Caspian allowed himself to imagine it. Walking away from Sinclair Industries, from the board meetings and hostile takeovers and quarterly profit projections that had consumed his existence. Returning to the research that had once filled him with wonder, the pure joy of discovery, the satisfaction of protecting something instead of exploiting it. The moment passed. Reality crashed back like a cold wave, reminding him of everything he had built, everything he stood to lose, everything that depended on his continued leadership of an empire built on oceanic destruction. His ultimatum was delivered with the cold precision that had made him a legend in corporate circles. She could leave voluntarily, or his security team would remove her by force. Either way, the platform would continue operations. Her response was a single word, delivered with such quiet conviction that it hit him harder than any shouted protest. No, she wasn't leaving. And with a certainty that both infuriated and intrigued him, she predicted that he wouldn't have her forcibly removed. Her reasoning cut to the heart of everything he had tried to forget. Despite everything he had done, everything he had become, he was still the man who had wanted to save the ocean. And that man wouldn't let his security team hurt someone who was trying to do what he couldn't. Then she smiled at him, and Caspian's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The expression was radiant, transformative, filled with a warmth that seemed to light up the gray afternoon and drive the breath from his lungs. His heart hammered against his ribs with an intensity that left him dizzy, his pulse racing like he was having some kind of cardiac episode. When was the last time someone had smiled at him like that, as if they saw something worth saving beneath the cold exterior he had cultivated so carefully? Marcus appeared at his elbow, requesting orders, but Caspian found himself staring at Luna as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Every instinct developed over 10 years of corporate warfare screamed at him to end this farce, restore order, maintain control through the efficient application of force. Instead, He heard himself ordering a full platform shutdown for scheduled maintenance. 24 hours, $2 million in lost revenue, a decision that would require explanations to his board, justifications to his shareholders, and acknowledgement that an environmental activist had somehow influenced his operational priorities. Marcus's face went pale, his objections sputtering about lost revenue and board reactions, but Caspian's attention remained fixed on Luna. In the sudden relative quiet as the platform's engines wound down, the sound of waves against steel supports became audible, a rhythm older than civilization, older than profit margins, older than the careful walls he had built around his heart. Her response to his decision was wonder, pure and simple. She asked why he had done it, and he found himself telling her a truth that surprised even him. Because she was right. The ocean remembered everything they did to it, and maybe it was time he started remembering too. As the platform fell silent, Luna reached up and worked at the lock on her chain. The metal clicked open. She had had the key the entire time, could have left hours ago. The realization that she had remained chained not because she had to, but because she chose to, hit him like a revelation. When he asked why she had stayed, her answer was simple, so they could have their conversation. Everything, the chain, the platform, the confrontation with his security team, had been orchestrated not to make a point to the media or public, but to force this specific moment between them. She walked to the platform's edge and looked out at the ocean, now visible in shades of gray and green without the distortion of industrial noise. Her question when she turned back was simple but devastating. What did he want the ocean to remember about him? As she moved past him toward the helicopter landing pad, Caspian caught the faintest scent of salt water, mixed with something floral, jasmine perhaps, or night-blooming cereus. The combination filled his senses with a warmth that spread through his chest like expensive brandy, awakening nerve endings that had been numb for years. He called after her, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. What would it take to make the ocean remember something good? Her smile when she turned back was small but genuine, and it hit him with the same devastating force as before. Her answer was simple, absolute, and completely terrifying. Everything. It would take everything. As Luna Reeves disappeared into the gray afternoon sky, Caspian stood alone on his silent oil platform and felt something stir in the depths of his carefully controlled heart. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The Sinclair Industries headquarters rose from Manhattan like a glass and steel monument to corporate ambition, its 43 floors reflecting the city's dreams back at itself in distorted fragments of light and shadow. Caspian's office occupied the apex, a testament to architectural minimalism, where every surface had been chosen for its inability to hold warmth or character. Chrome, black leather, and Norwegian granite created an environment as emotionally sterile as an operating theater, which had always suited him perfectly, until Platform 7 changed everything. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Luna Reeves, 3 days since he had last slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The way her dark hair had moved in the North Sea wind, the absolute certainty in her voice when she spoke about oceanic destruction, the devastating impact of her smile when she looked at him as if she could see straight through to the man he used to be. His reflection stared back from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Pale eyes, sharp cheekbones, the kind of face that closed billion-dollar deals and crushed competitors without revealing even a hint of the chaos brewing beneath the surface. But chaos it was. For a man who had built his empire on emotional control, the past 3 days had been a masterclass in internal anarchy. The irony wasn't lost on him that Luna Reeves had accomplished in 10 minutes what a decade of corporate warfare had failed to achieve. She had made him question everything about the empire he had built, the man he had become, and the price he had paid for both. Marcus Reed entered without invitation, a habit that usually amused Caspian, but today felt like an intrusion. The security chief moved with the controlled aggression of a man accustomed to solving problems through application of force. But his expression suggested those solutions were becoming increasingly inadequate. The board was asking uncomfortable questions about Platform 7, Marcus reported. A $2 million maintenance shutdown with 6 hours' notice didn't fit standard operating procedures, and several members were beginning to express concerns about Caspian's judgment. More troubling was their growing interest in Luna Reeves herself, her background, her capabilities, her potential threat to corporate security. Marcus had compiled a comprehensive background report, the kind of detailed investigation typically reserved for hostile takeover targets or corporate espionage suspects. As he recited Luna's biography, Caspian found himself building a mental portrait of someone who had chosen principle over profit at every opportunity, who lived in voluntary poverty while fighting battles she couldn't possibly win against opponents with unlimited resources. Luna Catherine Reeves, 32 years old, born to parents who had dedicated their lives to environmental protection and marine conservation. Her father had been a marine biologist, her mother an environmental lawyer. Between them, they had given their daughter both the scientific knowledge and legal framework necessary to wage war against corporate destroyers of oceanic ecosystems. The PhD in Marine Biology from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the specialization in deep-sea ecosystem restoration, the research position at NOAA that she had abandoned to found her own nonprofit. Every choice pointed toward someone driven by genuine passion, rather than career advancement or financial gain. Ocean's Voice operated on a shoestring budget, conducting educational outreach and small-scale conservation projects, while paying its founder a salary that wouldn't cover Caspian's monthly wine budget. The detail that hit him hardest was her isolation. Parents dead in a car accident when she was 26, no siblings, no significant romantic relationships in recent years. She was essentially alone in the world, fighting to save an ocean that most people saw only as a place to dispose of waste or extract resources. The loneliness he recognized, it was the same isolation he had cultivated, though his was self-imposed while hers seemed to be the price of caring about things that didn't generate quarterly profits. Marcus's recitation of her arrest record painted a picture of someone completely committed to her cause. 11 arrests in 2 years, all for peaceful environmental protests. She served her time, paid her fines, and returned immediately to activism, with the kind of stubborn persistence that corporate security chiefs found deeply troubling. The conversation took a dark turn when Marcus suggested making Luna Reeves go away permanently. The euphemism carried sinister implications: character assassination, financial destruction, even physical intimidation if circumstances required it. Activists had accidents all the time, Marcus noted with practiced indifference. Equipment failures, car crashes, muggings gone wrong. The ocean was a dangerous place. The suggestion sent rage coursing through Caspian's veins with volcanic intensity. The thought of Luna suffering any kind of harm triggered protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Emotions so fierce and immediate that they shocked him with their violence. His refusal came out with enough force to make Marcus blink in surprise, followed by explicit orders that Luna was not to be touched, threatened, intimidated, or harmed in any way. Marcus's suspicion was evident in his expression. His questions about Caspian's protective instincts toward an environmental activist who represented a clear threat to their operations. But Caspian couldn't explain what he didn't fully understand himself: that Luna Reeves had somehow become precious to him in ways that defied rational analysis, that her safety mattered more than corporate security, that the thought of her being hurt made him want to burn the world down. After Marcus left, Caspian returned to the windows, but the city below had lost its power to distract him. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and his heart hammered against his ribs when he realized the sender's identity. Luna had thanked him for shutting down Platform 7, noting that even 24 hours mattered to marine life in the area. The simplicity of her gratitude, the genuine warmth in her words, hit him harder than any corporate negotiation or boardroom victory. When was the last time someone had thanked him for anything beyond increasing their stock value or eliminating their competition? Their text exchange was brief but devastating. She had obtained his private number through considerable effort and expertise, motivated by her commitment to ocean conservation. When he challenged her about what motivated her personally, her answer was immediate and transformative: hope. The belief that people could change, that someone who had once wanted to save the ocean might remember why. Her words reached across digital space and grabbed him by the throat. She was talking about him, about the man he used to be before pragmatism and profit margins had calcified around his heart like scar tissue. The man who had once stood on research vessels and felt genuine wonder at the complexity and beauty of marine ecosystems. His cynical response, that people didn't change. They just learned to hide better, earned him a reply that shattered his defenses completely. She didn't believe that, and she didn't think he did either. Not completely. When he asked what it would take to convince her otherwise, her answer was simple and devastating. Nothing. Because she had seen who he really was, and she wasn't giving up on him. That night, for the first time since taking control of Sinclair Industries, Caspian left the office before midnight. He drove through Manhattan's Canyon of Lights, not toward his penthouse apartment, but toward Brooklyn, toward a borough he had never had reason to visit before Luna Reeves entered his life like a force of nature. He found Ocean's Voice headquarters in a converted warehouse near the waterfront, the building dark except for a single window on the third floor, where warm light spilled onto the street below. He parked across the street and looked up at that window, wondering if she was behind it, wondering what she was doing, writing grant applications, planning her next protest, or simply sitting by the window thinking about the ocean that had shaped her entire existence. A shadow moved across the lit window and his pulse jumped. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons he shouldn't be there. Security risks, potential for misinterpretation, the sheer inappropriateness of a corporate CEO stalking an environmental activist through Brooklyn streets. But the rational part of his mind had been losing ground steadily since Platform 7, replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. The treacherous belief that maybe Luna Reeves was right. Maybe people could change. Maybe it wasn't too late to remember who he used to be before the world taught him that caring about anything was a weakness to be exploited. He sat in his car until the light went out, then drove home through streets that seemed brighter than before, charged with possibilities he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, he made an anonymous donation to Ocean's Voice. $500,000. Enough to fund their operations for a decade, but not so large as to draw unwanted attention. Her text message arrived within hours. Someone had donated enough money to actually make a difference, and she hoped whoever it was knew that hope was contagious. Caspian Sinclair stared at Luna Reeves' message until the screen went dark, then opened it again to reread her words about hope being contagious, and for the first time in 10 years, he was beginning to understand what she meant, which terrified him more than any hostile takeover he had ever faced. The Sinclair Industries boardroom occupied an entire floor of Manhattan real estate, its panoramic windows offering views that seemed to place its occupants above the concerns of ordinary mortals. The conference table was carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, polished to mirror perfection, surrounded by 18 leather chairs that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. It was a room designed to intimidate, to remind everyone present that they existed at the pleasure of extraordinary wealth and power. Caspian sat at the head of the table in a pose of calculated authority, his fingers steepled before him as he studied the faces of men who had helped him build a global empire and who would destroy him without hesitation if they perceived him as a threat to their continued prosperity. These were not individuals accustomed to being summoned without explanation, particularly by someone whose recent behavior had begun to raise uncomfortable questions about his judgment and priorities. Harrison Blackwood, the board's longest-serving member and most vocal critic, leaned forward with predatory interest. At 73, he possessed the lean hunger of a man who had spent 5 decades consuming competitors and spitting out their bones. His expression suggested he smelled weakness in the water and was preparing to feed. The announcement Caspian delivered should have been routine corporate strategy. A new division focused on renewable energy research. Initial funding of $2 billion. Operations beginning immediately. It was exactly the kind of diversification that forward-thinking energy companies were pursuing as fossil fuel. Markets became increasingly volatile and public. Opinion shifted toward environmental consciousness. But the silence that followed his words was profound enough to hear the building's climate control system cycling through its mechanical respirations. 18 pairs of eyes fixed on him with laser intensity, searching for signs of mental breakdown, hostile takeover, or elaborate practical joke. The skepticism was understandable. Caspian Sinclair announcing investment in renewable energy was like a tobacco executive promoting lung cancer research. Theoretically possible, but requiring explanations that went far beyond standard business logic. David Sterling, the board's financial analyst, posed the obvious question: who would head this new division? They didn't exactly have renewable energy expertise in their current leadership structure, and $2 billion was a significant investment to place in unproven hands. This was the moment Caspian had been preparing for. The words that would either secure the support he needed or trigger a boardroom coup that could cost him everything he had built over the past decade. Dr. Luna Reeves would head the division. If the previous silence had been profound, this one approached the metaphysical. Harrison's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a particularly vibrant burgundy that suggested either apoplectic rage or imminent cardiac episode. The environmental activist who had chained herself to Platform 7? The woman who had been arrested 11 times protesting their operations? He wanted to put her in charge of a $2 billion division? Caspian's response was delivered with the calm precision that had made him legendary in corporate circles. He wanted to put a renowned marine biologist with extensive experience in environmental conservation in charge of developing renewable energy solutions. Her activism demonstrated commitment to the cause, not liability to the company. The argument that followed was predictable in its intensity and personal in its implications. Sterling pointed out that Luna Reeves was a radical who considered them the enemy, whose stated goal was the destruction of fossil fuel companies. Margaret Chen questioned whether $2 billion should be invested based on one woman's expertise, regardless of her qualifications. Others raised concerns about public relations, regulatory implications, and the message such an appointment would send to their traditional investor base. Every objection was reasonable from a conventional business perspective. Every concern was valid given Luna's history of environmental activism and public opposition to their operations. But Caspian found himself defending her with an intensity that surprised even him, citing her brilliance, her understanding of environmental challenges, her potential to neutralize external threats while providing internal expertise. It was a good argument, strategically sound, financially defensible, politically astute. It was also complete fiction, designed to conceal the truth he barely admitted to himself. He wanted Luna Reeves close to him, wanted to see what would happen if she applied her passionate conviction to something he was building instead of something she was trying to destroy. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. Caspian controlled 51% of Sinclair Industries stock, which meant his decisions were ultimately unassailable, regardless of board opposition. They could object, argue, and express concern, but they couldn't stop him from hiring Luna Reeves or funding her renewable energy research. When the room finally emptied, Harrison lingered behind with the expression of a man delivering funeral rites. This was a mistake, he warned, a $2 billion mistake driven by emotions Caspian couldn't afford to indulge. The woman had affected his judgment in ways he might not fully understand, and he needed to be careful she didn't cost him everything he had built. After Harrison left, Caspian stood alone in the boardroom. Looking out at the city he had conquered through ruthless efficiency and emotional detachment. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, Luna Reeves was working in her small office, fighting battles she couldn't win against opponents with unlimited resources. By tomorrow, he would offer her weapons she had never imagined. $2 billion. Corporate backing. The resources of a global energy company turned toward environmental protection instead of oceanic destruction. The question that kept him awake that night wasn't whether she would accept his offer. It was whether he was hiring her to save the ocean or to save himself from the man he had become in its destruction. The call to Luna Reeves was scheduled for the following morning, and Caspian Sinclair found himself more nervous about a 10-minute conversation with an environmental activist than he had ever been about billion-dollar mergers or hostile takeover attempts. Luna Reeves arrived at Sinclair Industries headquarters like a storm system moving through clear skies, unexpected, transformative, and impossible to ignore. Caspian watched from his office window as she emerged from a taxi onto Fifth Avenue. Her simple black dress and worn leather messenger, bag-marking her as fundamentally different from the corporate predators, who normally stalked these particular hunting grounds. She moved through the building's marble lobby with the confident stride of someone who belonged anywhere her principles took her, seemingly unimpressed by the architectural intimidation that had been designed to reduce visitors to manageable proportions. The security guards, receptionists, and elevator operators who normally processed corporate visitors with mechanical efficiency found themselves staring at her with undisguised curiosity, as if a mythical creature had wandered into their carefully ordered world. Their first meeting in his office was a masterclass in controlled tension. Two forces of nature circling each other with the wary respect of predators recognizing an equal. She studied his minimalist environment with analytical precision, taking in the chrome and granite surfaces that had been chosen specifically to discourage emotional connection or comfortable conversation. Her reaction to his renewable energy proposal was exactly what he had expected. Skepticism bordering on contempt. Suspicion that this was either a public relations stunt or an elaborate bribe designed to neutralize her activism. She questioned his motives, his commitment, and his understanding of the environmental challenges that his own operations had helped create. But when he revealed his past, the marine biology degree from Woods Hole, the doctoral research on ecosystem recovery, the published papers on environmental impact assessment, something shifted in her expression. The professional mask slipped just enough to reveal genuine surprise, followed by something that might have been recognition or even hope. He didn't apologize for his empire, didn't attempt to justify the decade he had spent converting oceanic resources into personal wealth. Instead, he made her an offer that surprised them both with its honesty. He wanted to build something she would be proud of. Not to atone for past destruction, not to improve his public image, but to create something worthy of the respect he saw in her eyes when she looked at the ocean. Her acceptance came with conditions that would have been non-negotiable from any other potential employee. Complete control over the division's research priorities, absolute transparency in all operations, and the right to publicize any findings regardless of their impact on Sinclair Industries' traditional business interests. The terms should have been unacceptable to any rational corporate leader. They essentially gave an environmental activist carte blanche to use his resources against his own financial interests, to expose practices that could trigger regulatory action or investor flight. But Caspian found himself agreeing without hesitation, as if her trust was more valuable than any potential financial loss. The weeks that followed were unlike anything in his corporate experience. Luna transformed the newly created Sinclair Renewable Energy Research Division from a theoretical concept into a functioning operation with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops for battle. She hired scientists, engineers, and researchers with the same passionate commitment to environmental protection that had driven her own activism. Working with her was like trying to contain lightning in corporate packaging. She pushed him to visit renewable energy sites across the country, to meet with researchers who spoke about solar efficiency and wind patterns with the same intensity she brought to oceanic conservation. She made him sit through presentations on carbon capture technology, attend conferences on sustainable energy development, and engage with concepts he hadn't considered since his graduate school days. More transformative was watching her work with his traditional employees, the oil industry veterans who had spent careers extracting wealth from environmental destruction. She didn't lecture or condemn them. Instead, she taught them about the renewable technologies that could replace their current operations, showed them how their expertise in energy production could be redirected toward environmental restoration rather than continued degradation. The changes in Caspian were subtle at first, then increasingly obvious to anyone who knew him well. He found himself studying renewable energy reports with the same intensity he had once reserved for quarterly profit projections. He began asking questions about environmental impact that would have been unthinkable during his previous decade of corporate leadership. Most disturbing and most wonderful was the way Luna's presence affected his emotional landscape. Her passion was contagious, reawakening parts of his personality that had been dormant since his transformation from idealistic scientist to ruthless corporate executive. He caught himself smiling during their meetings, genuinely engaged by discussions of offshore wind farms and solar panel efficiency, in ways that had nothing to do with profit, margins, or competitive advantage. The moment that shattered his remaining defenses came during a particularly successful presentation on renewable energy integration. They had just secured commitments from 3 major utilities to pilot Sinclair's new solar storage technology, a breakthrough that could revolutionize clean energy distribution. As Luna reviewed the contracts, her face lit up with genuine joy at the potential environmental impact. When she turned to share her excitement, her smile hit him like a physical force that drove the breath from his lungs. It wasn't the practiced expression of a professional colleague or the calculated charm of a corporate ally. It was pure, unguarded joy, the radiant expression of someone who had just watched her impossible dreams take their first steps toward reality. His heart hammered against his ribs with such violence that he wondered if he was having some kind of medical emergency. Heat flooded through his chest and spread outward like molten metal, awakening nerve endings that had been numb for years. The simple act of her genuine happiness at their shared success destroyed the last barriers around emotions he had thought permanently buried. In that moment, Caspian understood with crystalline clarity that he was falling in love with Luna Reeves. Not the careful, calculated affection of strategic alliance, but the devastating, transformative love that reduced grown men to trembling adolescents and made billionaires abandon empires for the chance. To see one woman smile, realization terrified him more than any corporate takeover or board rebellion ever had, because it meant he had something to lose that couldn't be replaced with money or power. That evening, as Luna worked late in her new office reviewing environmental impact studies, she had no idea that 40 floors above her, Caspian Sinclair was staring out at the city lights and trying to figure out how to tell a woman who had spent years fighting his empire that he would burn it all down just to keep her close. The Sinclair Industries board meeting convened in an atmosphere thick with the kind of tension that preceded corporate executions, the air conditioning unable to dispel the heat of collective anger that had been building for weeks. Caspian's recent behavior, the renewable energy division, the environmental activist installed as its head, the dramatic shift in company priorities had triggered alarm bells throughout the organization's power structure. Harrison Blackwood presided over the gathering with the satisfied expression of a man who had finally cornered his prey after months of careful stalking. Around the polished rosewood table, faces that had once shown respectful deference now displayed varying degrees of hostility, suspicion, and barely contained rebellion. The numbers they presented painted a picture of corporate transformation that looked suspiciously like corporate suicide. $2 billion redirected from profitable fossil fuel operations to speculative renewable energy research. Stock prices fluctuating as investors struggled to understand Sinclair Industries' new environmental consciousness. Competitors moving aggressively into markets that Caspian seemed to be abandoning in favor of what traditional energy executives dismissed as idealistic nonsense. More troubling were the operational changes that Luna's influence had triggered throughout the organization. Environmental impact assessments had become mandatory for all new projects. Sustainability consultants now sat in on strategic planning sessions. The company's public messaging had shifted from emphasizing energy production to promoting environmental responsibility, a transformation that traditional industry leaders found both incomprehensible and dangerous. Board's investigation into Luna Reeves revealed details that painted her influence as either masterful manipulation or genuine transformation, depending on one's perspective regarding Caspian's mental state. Her background check confirmed her credentials as a legitimate marine biologist, but also revealed the extent of her previous activism against fossil fuel companies, including Sinclair Industries specifically. More concerning was the evidence of Caspian's personal involvement in her life and career. The anonymous donations to Ocean's Voice, traced through financial channels that corporate security had eventually penetrated. His frequent visits to renewable energy sites that he had never shown interest in before her arrival, the dramatic changes in his decision-making patterns, his communication style, even his physical appearance. He had started wearing less formal clothing, smiled more during meetings, showed genuine enthusiasm for projects that would have bored him. Senseless 6 months earlier, Harrison's presentation to the board was a surgical dissection of what he characterized as Caspian's emotional compromise. The evidence suggested that their CEO had developed feelings for an environmental activist that were affecting his judgment in ways that threatened the entire organization. His protective instincts toward Luna, his willingness to invest corporate resources in her projects, his transformation from ruthless executive to something approaching a romantic idealist, all pointed toward a man whose decisions were being influenced by personal emotions, rather than strategic thinking. The board's conclusion was unanimous. Luna Reeves represented an existential threat to Sinclair Industries that required immediate neutralization, not through violence or direct confrontation. That would be too obvious and potentially explosive, but through more sophisticated means that would discredit her professionally while demonstrating to Caspian the dangers of allowing emotion to influence corporate policy. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Private investigators had discovered financial irregularities in Ocean's Voice's records, not criminal activity, but accounting inconsistencies that could be interpreted as evidence of fraud or embezzlement when presented to regulatory authorities and media outlets, combined with forged documents suggesting connections to radical environmental groups. The evidence would paint Luna as either corrupt or extremist, possibly both. The beauty of the plan was its plausible deniability. The leaked information would appear to come from government regulatory agencies, conducting routine investigations into nonprofit organizations. Luna would be discredited not by obvious corporate sabotage, but by apparently independent sources revealing her alleged misconduct and radical associations. Caspian would be forced to terminate her employment to protect the company from scandal, a decision that would simultaneously remove her influence and demonstrate the consequences of allowing personal feelings to compromise professional judgment. The renewable energy division could then be quietly dissolved, its resources redirected toward traditional fossil fuel operations, and corporate priorities returned to profit maximization rather than environmental ideology. The vote to authorize the operation was 18-1, Caspian himself being the sole dissenting voice. Though he wasn't present to cast it, implementation began immediately, with carefully orchestrated leaks to financial journalists who specialized in exposing nonprofit corruption. The story would break within 72 hours, time to maximize media impact and minimize Luna's ability to mount an effective defense. Corporate public relations specialists were already preparing statements, distancing Sinclair Industries from her alleged misconduct while expressing disappointment in her apparent betrayal of their trust. Harrison Blackwood signed the authorization documents with the satisfaction of a chess master executing a winning strategy. He had built his career on understanding that business was war conducted through legal means, that victory belonged to those willing to use any weapon available, and that emotional attachments were vulnerabilities to be exploited rather than indulged. Luna Reeves had made the tactical error of making Caspian Sinclair fall in love with her. Now she would discover that love was a weakness that corporate predators could weaponize with surgical precision. As the board members filed out of the conference room, none of them noticed that Caspian's assistant had been listening outside the door, or that she had immediately placed a call to warn Luna Reeves that her world was about to explode in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, delivered through every major financial news outlet with the coordinated precision of a military strike. Luna discovered the destruction of her reputation while reviewing environmental impact reports. In her Sinclair Industries office, her computer screen suddenly flooded with news alerts bearing her name and accusations that hit like physical blows. Ocean's Voice founder linked to radical environmental group, read the headline from the Wall Street Journal. Financial irregularities discovered in nonprofit conservation organization, declared the Financial Times. Environmental activists, secret funding sources raise questions, proclaimed Reuters. Each story built upon the others in a symphony of character assassination, painting Luna as either a financial fraud who had embezzled donations meant for oceanic conservation, or a radical extremist with connections to eco-terrorist organizations. The evidence presented was damning in its apparent authenticity. Accounting documents that showed suspicious financial transfers, communications that suggested coordination with militant environmental groups, tax filings that revealed unexplained sources of funding. Luna stared at her computer screen with the numb disbelief of someone watching their life's work incinerated by forces beyond their understanding or control. Every accusation was false, every piece of evidence either fabricated or misrepresented, but the media firestorm was already beyond containment. Ocean's Voice's board of directors was demanding her immediate resignation. Major donors were publicly distancing themselves from her organization. The renewable energy projects she had been developing at Sinclair Industries were being scrutinized for potential connections to her alleged misconduct. The financial documents were particularly sophisticated forgeries, showing patterns of suspicious transactions that painted her as someone who had been systematically stealing from her own nonprofit while using corporate connections to hide the evidence. The communications with radical groups were real emails, but doctored to suggest coordination rather than the routine information sharing that characterized her legitimate activism. Most devastating was the implication that her relationship with Caspian Sinclair was part of an elaborate scheme to infiltrate and sabotage fossil fuel operations from within. The story suggested that her hiring at Sinclair Industries was the culmination of a long-term plan to gain access to proprietary information that could be used against the energy industry, painting her as either a corporate spy or a seductive manipulator who had used romantic involvement to compromise a billionaire CEO's judgment. Her phone began ringing incessantly as journalists sought comments on the allegations. Colleagues distanced themselves from potential scandal, and friends expressed shock at revelations they couldn't reconcile with the Luna they thought they knew. Each conversation was a fresh humiliation, forcing her to defend herself against accusations so outrageous that her denials sounded hollow even to her own ears. The speed and coordination of the media assault suggested resources far beyond what any single news organization could marshal independently. Someone with significant power and unlimited financial backing had orchestrated this destruction with military precision, timing the releases for maximum impact while minimizing her ability to mount an effective defense. The realization that she was under attack by forces connected to Sinclair Industries hit her like a physical blow that left her gasping for breath. The timing was too perfect, the evidence too sophisticated, the media coordination too precise for this to be anything other than corporate retaliation for her environmental activism. Someone had decided that Luna Reeves posed an unacceptable threat and had deployed weapons she couldn't hope to counter. But who? And why now? When she was working within the system rather than against it? When she had found a way to pursue environmental protection through corporate partnership rather than external opposition? The answer came in the form of a phone call from Margaret Chen, the youngest board member and the only one who had shown any sympathy for environmental concerns during her brief tenure at Sinclair Industries. Margaret's voice was tight with a mixture of guilt and warning as she revealed the board's decision to neutralize Luna's influence through character assassination. They had seen her impact on Caspian, Margaret explained, had witnessed his transformation from ruthless corporate executive to something approaching an environmental idealist. The board had concluded that Luna represented an existential threat to their traditional business model, and had authorized her destruction through methods that would appear to have nothing to do with Sinclair Industries. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it shattered Luna's remaining illusions about corporate ethics and her own naivety in believing she could change a system designed to resist transformation through the application of unlimited resources and surgical ruthlessness. As Margaret's words sank in, Luna felt something cold and bitter settling in her chest, like poison ivy taking root. She had been manipulated from the beginning, her hiring designed not to genuine environmental progress, but to provide cover for continued oceanic destruction while neutralizing her as an external threat. Even worse, her feelings for Caspian, the growing respect and reluctant affection she had developed for a man who seemed to be remembering his better nature, had been weaponized against both of them by corporate predators who viewed emotion as weakness to be exploited. The knock on her office door came as she was clearing personal belongings from her desk, knowing that her termination was inevitable, regardless of her innocence. She expected security guards or human resources representatives delivering formal notice of her dismissal. Instead, Caspian Sinclair stood in her doorway with an expression she had never seen before. A mixture of rage, pain, and something that might have been protective fury. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, as if he had been sleeping in boardrooms, his pale eyes blazing with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite everything that had happened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that contained all the accusations flying through media channels, all the implications about manipulation and betrayal, all the questions about what had been real and what had been calculation in their complicated relationship. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled precision of a man barely containing volcanic emotions. He knew about the board's operation, had discovered their plan too late to prevent it, but in time to understand the full scope of their betrayal. They had used his feelings for her as a weapon against both of them, exploiting his emotional vulnerability to justify actions that would have been unthinkable under normal corporate circumstances. His words should have been comforting, validation, that she wasn't paranoid or delusional, confirmation that the attacks against her were as fabricated and malicious as she had believed. Instead, they filled her with a cold fury that had nothing to do with corporate betrayal and everything to do with personal violation. Luna looked at Caspian Sinclair standing in her doorway, with fury and pain warring in his pale eyes, and realized that whether he had been complicit in her destruction or simply naive about his board's capabilities, she could no longer trust him with the heart she had been foolish enough to give to a man whose empire was built on the bones of everything she loved. The confrontation erupted in Luna's office with the violence of a North Sea squall. 10 days of suppressed emotion and mutual betrayal finally bursting through the professional courtesy that had barely contained them since the media assault began. Luna stood behind her desk like a general defending her lost stronghold, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that made Caspian's heart race. Despite the devastation surrounding them, she was packing the remnants of her tenure at Sinclair, industries into cardboard boxes, personal photographs, environmental reports, research notes that represented months of work toward renewable energy solutions that would now never see implementation. The sight of her belongings reduced to office debris filled him with a rage so pure it felt like molten steel in his veins. The media firestorm had continued for over a week, each day bringing fresh accusations and manufactured evidence designed to destroy her credibility and professional reputation. Ocean's Voice had terminated her position to avoid association with the scandal. The renewable energy projects she had developed were being quietly shelved to minimize corporate exposure to her alleged misconduct. Even her apartment lease was under threat, as her landlord expressed concerns about harboring someone under federal investigation for financial fraud. Caspian had spent the past 10 days in a state of controlled fury, using every resource at his disposal to trace the origins of the attack against her, while simultaneously trying to protect both Luna and his company from the fallout. His investigation had led inevitably back to his own board of directors, to men he had trusted with his empire who had decided that his emotional attachment to an environmental activist represented an unacceptable threat to their continued prosperity. But Luna's reaction to his presence in her office made clear that his investigation and protective efforts were too little, too late. She looked at him with a mixture of contempt and heartbreak that cut deeper than any corporate betrayal he had ever experienced. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady but filled with a bitterness that seemed to poison the air between them. She had figured out the truth, she told him. Not the specific details of the board's operation, but the larger pattern that revealed her position at Sinclair Industries as an elaborate manipulation designed to neutralize her environmental activism while providing corporate cover for continued oceanic destruction. Accusation hit him like a physical blow, partly because it revealed how completely the board's plan had succeeded in destroying her trust, and partly because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. He had hired her for complex motives that included genuine admiration for her expertise, romantic attraction he barely admitted to himself, and strategic calculation about neutralizing external opposition to his operations. His attempts to explain the situation, to reveal his own investigation into the board's betrayal, to demonstrate that he had been manipulated as much as she had, fell on ears deafened by pain and professional destruction. She interrupted his explanations with a laugh that contained no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who had finally understood the full scope of her naivety. She had seen a monster in him from the beginning, she said, and she had been right all along. Her voice carried the weight of someone mourning not just her destroyed career, but the death of hope she had been foolish enough to nurture for his redemption. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, accusations and counter-accusations flying between them like weapons designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. She accused him of using her feelings to manipulate her into corporate compliance. He accused her of willful blindness to his genuine transformation and protective efforts. She pointed out that his empire remained built on oceanic destruction regardless of his renewable energy investments. He reminded her that those investments had been real, significant, and directed entirely according to her environmental priorities. But beneath the anger and mutual recrimination, Caspian could see the deeper pain that was driving Luna's fury. She wasn't just angry about the media assault or the destruction of her career. She was heartbroken about the betrayal of feelings she had allowed herself to develop for him. The hope she had invested in his capacity for genuine change. The possibility she had glimpsed of partnership between former enemies united by shared environmental commitment. The realization that she had cared about him, genuinely, deeply, beyond professional collaboration or strategic alliance, hit him with devastating force. Whatever calculation had motivated his initial offer to her, whatever complex mix of attraction and admiration had driven his subsequent behavior, his feelings had evolved into something far more dangerous: love. Not the careful affection of corporate partnership, but the consuming, transformative love that made billionaires abandon empires and inspired environmental activists to trust oil industry titans with their dreams, and the board's operation had destroyed that possibility as surely as an oil spill destroyed coral reefs, leaving nothing but contaminated emotional wreckage in its wake. When Luna finally ran out of accusations and fury, when her voice broke on words that revealed the depth of her pain and disappointment, Caspian made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He told her everything, about the board's plan, about his attempts to protect her, about the investigation he had conducted, and the evidence he had gathered. But most importantly, he told her about his feelings, about the way she had transformed him from someone who exploited the ocean into someone who wanted to protect it, about the love he had been too afraid to acknowledge until it was too late to matter. His confession was raw, honest, and utterly vulnerable in ways that corporate training had taught him to avoid. But Luna's response was not the forgiveness or understanding he desperately hoped for. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the man he had become under her influence. She gathered her remaining belongings and walked past him toward the door, pausing only to deliver words that hit him like physical blows. She had wasted months trying to save a man who had never really existed, and she wouldn't make that mistake again. As Luna Reeves walked out of his life and into the gray Manhattan afternoon, Caspian Sinclair stood alone in her empty office and understood for the first time what it meant to lose something more valuable than any empire he had ever built. The storm that brought Caspian to the abandoned oil platform was as much internal as meteorological, a perfect tempest of guilt, rage, and desperate love that had been building for the 3 weeks since Luna walked out of his life, and into a future that seemed impossible to navigate without her. Platform Omega had been his first major acquisition, a rusted monument to his early ambitions that had been decommissioned 5 years earlier when newer technology made its operations obsolete. Now it stood in the North Sea like a mechanical gravestone, its silent machinery a testament to everything he had been before Luna showed him another way to exist in the world. He had come here not for nostalgia or symbolic gestures, but because this was where Luna had gone when the pain became unbearable, and she needed solitude to mourn not just her destroyed career, but the death of hope she had been foolish enough to nurture for his redemption. His security team had tracked her movements, revealing her journey from Manhattan to this desolate platform where she could grieve in private. The helicopter flight through worsening weather had given him time to rehearse words that might penetrate the walls of hurt and betrayal she had built around herself. But as he rappelled from the aircraft onto storm-lashed steel decking, Caspian realized that no amount of corporate negotiation experience could prepare him for this confrontation. Luna stood at the platform's edge, her dark hair whipping in winds that carried the scent of approaching hurricane weather. She wore the same gray sweater she had worn during their first encounter, now soaked through by spray from waves that crashed against the platform's supports with increasing violence. Her silhouette against the storm-darkened sky was both magnificent and heartbreaking, a portrait of someone who had lost everything, but refused to surrender the dignity that defined her. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't acknowledge his presence until he stood close enough to touch her. When she finally spoke, her voice barely audible above the wind and waves, her words carried the weight of absolute finality. She knew why he had come, she said. She knew about his investigation into the board's operation, about his attempts to clear her name, about his efforts to provide support through intermediaries. She knew, and it didn't matter anymore. Some kinds of damage were permanent, irreversible, beyond the reach of corporate solutions or romantic gestures. Her words hit him with the force of the storm surrounding them, stripping away the last illusions he had maintained about their relationship and his capacity for redemption. But Caspian had not flown through hurricane weather to deliver conventional apologies. He had come to do something unprecedented in his adult life: tell the complete truth regardless of its impact on his carefully constructed image. The confession that emerged from him was as raw and uncontrolled as the storm itself. Words torn from places he had kept sealed for years. He told her about falling in love with her from that first moment on Platform 7. About the way her smile had shattered emotional defenses he had spent a decade building. He told her about lying awake at night thinking about her voice, her passion, the way she looked at him, as if she could see straight through to the man he used to be. But most importantly, he told her the truth about his transformation. She hadn't just made him remember who he used to be. She had made him want to become someone worthy of her respect. Someone who could stand beside her without shame. Someone who could look in the mirror and recognize the reflection staring back at him. He told her that he loved her. Not the careful, calculated affection of strategic alliance, but the devastating, transformative love that had reduced him to a man who would abandon everything he had built for the chance to see her smile again. He loved her intelligence, her passion, her absolute refusal to compromise her principles. He loved the way she challenged him, the way she made him feel alive after years of emotional numbness, the way she had given him hope that he could be better than the monster he had become. The wind seemed to pause as his words hung between them, and for a moment the only sound was waves against steel, and his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. When Luna finally turned to face him, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. She looked at him for a long time, studying his face with an intensity that made his pulse race. What she saw there, in his pale eyes that had lost their calculating coldness, in the way his hands shook despite his attempts at control, in the complete vulnerability of a man who had stripped away every defense, seemed to surprise her with its authenticity. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She told him that she had fallen in love with him too, despite every rational reason not to. She had loved the moments when his mask slipped, and she glimpsed the passionate scientist he had once been. She had loved watching him discover that he could care about something more than profit margins, that he could feel joy in creating instead of destroying. She had loved the way he looked at her as if she were precious beyond measure, as if her opinion mattered more than any board vote or quarterly report. But love wasn't enough, she said. Not when the world seemed determined to destroy anyone who dared to hope for something better. His response came from the deepest part of his soul, the place where Luna had awakened feelings he thought were dead forever. Love was everything, he told her. It was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could transform monsters into men, the only thing worth risking everything to protect. He was prepared to walk away from his empire, he said. Not to build something new, not to atone for past sins, but simply to be with her. He would give up his wealth, his power, his carefully constructed life if it meant they could start over together. He would be nobody, own nothing, risk everything for the chance to wake up beside her every morning and fall asleep holding her every night. The storm reached full intensity as they stood facing each other on the abandoned platform, wind and rain creating a natural barrier that isolated them from everything except the choice that would determine their future together. Luna stepped toward him through the hurricane winds. Her eyes locked on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. When she reached for his hands, when her fingers intertwined with his despite the cold and rain, Caspian felt his heart stop and restart with a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. She told him that she loved him enough to believe in second chances, enough to trust that the man she had fallen for was real, despite everything that had tried to destroy them. She told him that she didn't need him to give up his empire. She needed him to use it differently. Not for environmental causes or public redemption, but to build a life they could share without shame, a future where their love could grow instead of being weaponized by those who saw emotion as weakness. The rain soaked through their clothes as they stood holding hands in the middle of the storm, but neither of them felt the cold. Caspian looked into Luna's eyes and saw his future reflected there. Not the sterile perfection of corporate success, but the messy, complicated, wonderful reality of sharing a life with someone who had seen him at his worst and chose to love him anyway. When she rose on her tiptoes to whisper in his ear that she had never stopped believing in him, even when she wanted to, his arms came around her with desperate tenderness. He held her against his chest as if she might disappear, as if the storm might tear her away from him before he could tell her everything he felt. He told her that she was his heart, his redemption, his reason for wanting to be better than he had ever imagined possible. He told her that loving her had taught him the difference between existing and living, between success and happiness, between having everything and having what mattered. As the storm began to subside around them, they stood together on the platform where his old life had ended and their new one was beginning. The ocean spread before them in all directions, no longer a resource to be exploited but a witness to the love that had survived corporate betrayal, media assassination, and their own fears about whether redemption was possible for people like them. Luna looked up at him with eyes that held no doubt, no reservation, only the absolute certainty of a woman who had found her home in the heart of a man she had helped transform from destroyer to protector. When she smiled, that radiant, devastating smile that had first shattered his defenses, Caspian felt his world tilt on its axis one final time. This time, it settled into perfect balance. 2 years later, Caspian and Luna exchanged vows on a beach in San Diego, where she had first fallen in love with the ocean as a child. Surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed their transformation from enemies to soulmates, their voices carrying across the waves as they promised to love each other through storms and sunshine, through success and failure, through every challenge that life might bring to two people who had learned that the greatest empire ever built was the one they created together in each other's hearts.